right. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to another amazing session of the Book of Illuminations. I'm so happy to be back, and thank you, Rami, for an amazing introduction last week. It was so wonderful that we had a very kind soul, Anila, worried about the sheikh and his brother and the neighbors. So we actually got a really huge grocery order last night of food. So I think she didn't know that I was back, and she was worried that the troops here would not have enough to eat. So thank you so much, dear Anila, for sending us enough rations to survive for a while. So we're so grateful. So anyway, I'm really grateful for Rami always to be ready to step in and give us his very wonderful insights on various things. But it's always really nice, obviously, to go back and see my parents. I've recently joined this club inadvertently, known as, the Take Care of Your Aging Parents Club, which not everyone has, the blessing of joining. It's the blessing and, and burden and responsibility. But it's like one of these things that everyone will, well, not everyone, but a lot of people will reach. I know it's something, I'm an only child, and so it's something that I've worried about since I was a little kid, like what would happen when my parents get really old. And now they're at that age where, alhamdulillah, they're okay, but they need some care. And, these sorts of things always make you reflect, especially, you see how many people pass in the world. We had the amazing Sinead O'Connor, pass away this week, and she's my age. And so it just makes you really think about the passage of time, the precious amount of life, that we have. I'm kind of sitting in the middle. I'm seeing my parents' age and thinking about how to care for them, looking at Mito, our youngest son, getting ready to go to college, and then, hearing about people who pass that we admire also, like Sheikh talked about yesterday in the khutbah, Sinead O'Connor, but also Shabir Akhtar, who wrote an amazing book, Faith for All Seasons, which was very instrumental in a lot of people's faith journey. And of course, we commemorated the life of Ahmed Jamal a couple of weeks back when we learned of his passing. We have some incredible superstars that are real, role models for us on this journey. It makes me always think about, the legacy that you leave behind, right? Because we're all going to face the end, and really what matters at that moment is when you look back and you say, what did you leave behind for people behind you? How will people remember you? And it's one of these things that really helps you to think about what's important in life. When I was visiting with some friends back in LA, one of my dearest friends is younger than me, 44. She was a mom of one of the kids that Mito went to school with. And she was having breakfast with me and my other friend who's 50. And so at 44, she said, well, do you have any advice for what's it like to be in your 50s? Which is sort of funny. And it was that it's really important to think about, what is the legacy you leave behind? What was your life about? What did you stand for? Because, we could go at any moment, and that's like, how do you want to be remembered? And I think we talk about that a lot here. And how important when things are, at the end, that you have so much good to be remembered by, and not the opposite. So that helps put everything into perspective. So I'm always grateful for that. It's hard to travel, it's hard to be away, but it also gives you such a nice perspective on your life when you return, and also on the lives of other people that you meet along the way. So I'm so grateful for that. Happy to be back. And then I also just, of course, have to talk about yesterday's really brilliant khutbah. I mean, they're always brilliant. It's interesting, like yesterday's khutbah, again, went over an hour, and, there's so much important learning that goes on. And it's one thing when you actually experience it live, and then also when I listen to it back, I actually pick up again so much more. So I, took the opportunity to listen to it again, and it's really brilliant how all of the things that Sheikh covered come together. So the title is The Lifeline of Current Events and the Myth of Ijtihad. He covers so much more. I mean, just to kind of give you a flavor for what he talked about, We used to have, I guess, in the Islamic tradition, a history of covering current events as a means of understanding our priority as Muslims and what we should be spending our time on. And that has changed dramatically for us now with the age of colonialism, where there's been an active move for Muslims to really focus on things that are outside of current events. So, this movement to exoticize Islam, this is part of the colonial, plan to gain control of these massive populations of people. But if we exoticize Islam, make people focus on small issues like things around women, for example, then we can operate outside of that and have Muslims exist in a secular world where we're focused on really killing democracy. And Sheikh goes through and gives examples of what that means, like what it meant for us to actually go from having a real engagement with current events as Muslims to now having current events actually be something that Muslims themselves are not really engaged in, or we have a certain current event for the masses, and then current events also exists among the elite, people who are in power. And so, he gives some examples of the people who are in power, like the example of the coup in Niger that took place recently. The person at the head of that coup was trained by the U.S., as were the people at the heads of many coups in countries around the world. And largely, Sheikh does an incredible job of walking us through this, but as we can imagine, that colonial effort is for the sake of getting control of natural resources that are in various countries. You train these military leaders that Islam is the enemy, and that we don't want to let people in civil society have an Islamic presence. We control that. And then, basically the leaders in charge get a ton of money. There's a ton of corruption. The people in power get to control, this massive, resource through paying off military leaders. We have corruption. They don't really care about Muslims at the lower level. Where they, repress us and, have their own secret agenda. And then ultimately, we end up with the world that we're in. So, I really encourage people, it's a long khutbah as usual. It's so rich. It's so important. Again, if you don't have time to watch it, you can read our edited version in next week's weekly email. But I'm just struck every week after week. It's such an incredible education. And these khutbahs are like none other. I'm so excited when I see messages from people that say, the khutbahs that take place here are like nothing else. And so I just really want to encourage people to spread the word about these khutbahs. It's like, if you guys know of a better khutbah somewhere else, let us know. But if not, tell everybody the best khutbahs happen here in terms of how to encourage Muslims to be very ethically minded and connected, obviously, to current events that matter. So current events that affect the masses, not just the people that are in power. And then lastly, in the second khutbah, Sheikh spent some time talking about the arrest of another Sheikh in Saudi Arabia who is not political at all, who basically just said, fear God. He quoted the Quran, and that was enough for him to get arrested and disappeared. He had a huge following. And talk about Sinead O'Connor, God bless her soul, Ahmed Jamal, and also Shabir Akhtar. And it was really important that, Shabir Akhtar has been an incredible, scholar and he's someone that actually Sheikh knows, and, people that we know and love and respect. And he's someone that Muslims don't really know, and they're not familiar with his work. But the work that he's done, he was actually an expert in biblical studies, and so the work that he did made it very easy for people to see, how the Quran compares and, why it makes sense to be Muslim, when you are doing a lot of that comparison with biblical studies. And this kind of knowledge is exactly what Muslims need to address these crises of faith and, all the things that Muslims are struggling with, if they decide to invest in learning, in reading their books. If Muslim, communities invited scholars, this is the knowledge that makes a difference, and especially, the knowledge that we cover here. So there was just so much, again, in that very rich khutbah, so I really want to encourage everyone to watch it. And lastly, one of one of our friends said that the last part of the khutbah was so powerful on Shabir Akhtar that he asked if we could cut an excerpt to share it. Because I know it's hard for people to see, oh my God, this video is 2 hours long or 1 hour long or even 30 minutes long. And so that's why we do try to cut excerpts to give people a flavor of what we do here. And then it occurred to me that I want to reach out to friends, all of you who watch what we do. And if you find that there is something that we could excerpt, something that really moved you, that made a difference for you, guaranteed that will make a difference for someone else. And oftentimes, we get so busy that oftentimes we don't have time always to identify the right excerpt. And then also, it comes from the lens of, 1 or 2 people. And it just occurred to me, well, you know what, I'm sure if I could reach out, people are always asking, how can I help? Let us know if you find a segment of the tafsir or Book of Illuminations or khutbah or anything that really touched your heart. Just email me the approximate, time stamp, and then we'll cut it. And then other people can also be touched by it. I think that would be extremely valuable. And people have said that these short excerpts are really powerful for understanding what we do. So anyway, if you guys have time to do that, would be very, very appreciated. I'm so excited to continue on this journey with the Book of Illuminations. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين توكلنا على الله ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله اللهم صل على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين محمد المرسل رحمة للعالمين خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى صحبه المختارين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Is the sound okay?
Keep going.
Keep going? All right, so we finished number 23 in our last halaqa, and we start with 24. From 24 to 31, it should go faster because these aphorisms from 24 to 31 complement and complete one another. They're all connected, as you'll see. I don't know if we'll be able to cover all up to 31 tonight, but anyway, it should go faster, at least in the realm of just comprehension. As you'll notice that although they involve less in terms of analytical concepts, internalizing and incorporating these aphorisms so that they are comfortably a part of your psychology is a lot of work, and they're challenging, but that's not surprising. Okay, so we left off with 23, which is actually quite related to 24, was so if you remember, we talked with 23, just what was it? That we said that it resembled the earlier aphorism, I forgot what number it was, but the here is that it is dangerous to wait until things, or to convince yourself that, well, I'm going to wait until things work out the way I want them to work out, and that's when I begin my journey to Allah, or that begins when I begin my spiritual work. That your attitude always as to work with the active assumption that tomorrow will be no different than today, and that in fact there is no tomorrow, and that is what you are always manage and deal with your time and deal with your priorities, with the assumption that, as we see all the time, you could go anytime, and what you need to accomplish. And then we also talked about the very important practice, more than concept, of muraqabah, and that is the persistence and the diligence, whether, as we said, the muraqabat al-qalb, muraqabat al-rawh, muraqabat al-sir, which we covered in the last halaqah. So 24 flows naturally from the preceding aphorisms. And first let me read the Arabic, and then let's work through. Okay, so لا تستغرب وقوع الأقدار ما دمت في هذه الدار، فإنها ما أبرزت إلا ما هو مستحق وصفها، ما أبرزت إلا ما هو مستحق وصفها، ما هو مستحق وصفها وواجب نعتها. لا تستغرب وقوع الأقدار ما دمت في هذه الدار، فإنها ما أبرزت إلا ما هو مستحق وصفها وواجب نعتها. The Arabic is quite eloquent, and the eloquence inevitably is quite a bit of it is lost in the English translation. But the meaning is straightforward enough. Yeah, okay. So لا تستغرب وقوع الأقدار, it's quite straightforwardly, do not be surprised if things do not go your way. Do not be surprised, or do not expect or anticipate hardship. That's the point, to anticipate hardship. ما دمت في هذا الدار, as long as you are in this world. فإنها ما أبرزت إلا ما هو مستحق وصفها وواجب نعتها. What he's saying here is this world, in the word we use in Arabic and in the Quran for this world is the dunya, the lower world. And the dunya also means not just the lower world, but the lesser world. That we live in a world that is the lesser, the lower. And the very nature of, from an Islamic perspective, the very nature of our life in this world is we exist in this world to be tested for a life that follows, that is in every way the real life, that this, with all its, everything we engage in, it is really a plane in which we come with the express purpose of overcoming challenges and bearing a covenant. And the covenant imposes charges and obligations upon us. And Allah tells us that in bearing this covenant, in carrying this covenant, whether because it is Allah's purpose or whether because there are existing opposing forces, demonic forces, forces that have the express purpose of subverting God's path, that discharging our obligations towards this covenant that we bear is not going to be an easy path. So in other words, this world is a world of tribulations and tests, of a world, a plane in which we are tested. And the very straightforward point that to come to a place where you are supposed to be tested and you are supposed to prove yourself by passing the test, and to orient your psychology towards either every time you're tested you are surprised or disappointed or shocked or dismayed, or if your attitude towards the world is, I want to achieve a goal where there is just utter, complete happiness, where there are no waves, there are no hardship, there are no bumps on the road, it is self-defeating, because that is not the nature of this world. And in fact, the irony is that because we know, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that al-mu'minu mubtala, that if you are, the closer you are to God, the harder your tests. And the Prophet ﷺ, in another hadith, it's a bit long, but the Prophet ﷺ says, أيها الناس إن هذه الدار دار التواء، أي لا دار استواء، ومنزل طرح لا منزل فرح، فمن عرفها لم يفرح لرخائها ولم يحزن لشقائها. What the Prophet is saying is, this is a quote from a khutbah, that he gave. So in this khutbah, in this quote, he's saying, this world, darul tuwa, la darul istiwa, it is the nature of life on this earth is one where things will not go your way. Iltiwa is what is twisted and not straightforward. Istiwa is what is not twisted and indeed straightforward. So the Prophet ﷺ is telling you that this world is a world of twists and turns. And manzilu tarah, la manzilu farah, that in fact it is a place of tests and hardships, not a place of indulgence and happiness. So if you truly know your world, you will neither lose perspective when things go your way, when you enjoy luxury, لِرَخَائِهَا, that when it's working out for in your favor, you will always have the perspective that this doesn't mean that whatever good you are enjoying will last, and it doesn't mean the end of hardships, and it doesn't mean that that necessarily by enjoying material well-being that you are in good standing with God. Indeed, often hardships is a far surer indication that you are in good standing with God than the opposite of hardships. And remember that it is a tenet of Islamic theology that whatever hardships you endure in this earth, if you are if you have sabr, if you endure these hardships with patience and with iman, that all of that counts in your favor in the hereafter. So much so that there are numerous ahadith and statements by companions and many statements by Imam Ali and Ja'far al-Sadiq and others, that in the hereafter, often those who suffered the most on earth will be the object of real envy. So people are going to look at them and see what they got because of the hardships they endured. And as long as they endured these hardships with forbearance and patience and iman and faith. And in fact, people are going to say, I wish I endured this. Are going to be wishing that they were the ones who suffered in this way in earth. So all these people that you often see in this world, and now of course with a very important proviso, that is never, and it is a grave sin just because God's goodness will reward people for the pain and hardship they endure in this earth. It is ta'alluh Allah. Ta'alluh Allah is to act as if you are a God over God. If you mix this with an attitude of deconstructing the imperative of justice. In other words, if you tell yourself or tell people, well, these people who are suffering, they'll be rewarded in the hereafter. So this takes us off the hook when it comes to justice in this world. So in other words, we should not be so concerned about the imperative of justice because, these poor folks, they'll be rewarded by God. You are committing, if people understood how grave this sin has been described as a shirk al-akbar, although I hear a lot of Muslims do it all the time. Some tragedy will happen and then I hear a Muslim say, well, it's okay because the reward is with Allah. That is none of your business. What you are charged with on this earth is not that the reward is with Allah. What you're charged with on this earth is how to address the injustice of their suffering. That is what God will ask you about. Now, you do not use God's forbearance and mercy and compassion to somehow mitigate the obligation of justice. That's shirk. And so many scholars, including Ghazali for instance, it describes it as a shirk akbar, as a grand form of shirk, because effectively you are upstaging God. You are overthrowing God, and you are saying, well, I've decided that they're all going to be rewarded, and the rewards makes justice a lesser obligation in this world. God has not given you that authority, and that is clearly exceeding your bounds. But going back to this hadith, that, or part of the khutbah, that so you are, in other words, you are a balanced human being who is anchored, a balanced human being meaning a reasonable human being. You neither become exalted and lose perspective when things are going your way, and at the same time you don't fall apart and utterly despair. Does it sound okay? When things are not going your way. So you don't crash, you don't fall apart when there's hardship. And you don't become, as a lot of rich people become, arrogant and haughty and self-involved when things are going your way. You always understand that if things, in fact, if God is giving you a lot of blessings and God is giving you what you want, if God gives you health, gives you, whatever, a good job, a good marriage, the children you want, you're proud of your children, life is working out for you in every way. You have a beautiful home, you have whatever. What tempers that is an active concern about what the implications of all these blessings are in the hereafter. Because that means your accountability is going to be higher, much higher, than someone who doesn't have what you've been given, who doesn't have the job, who doesn't have the good marriage, who doesn't have the good children, who doesn't have the good house, or doesn't have the good health. This is why the Prophet ﷺ, in another, some have said that this hadith is mutawatir, highest level of authenticity, in the opinion of a number of scholars, or a large number of scholars. The well-known hadith that ad-dunya sijnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir. In some versions of hadith, we just have ad-dunya sijnul mu'min, and we don't have the second half, jannatul kafir, but it's probably just has been dropped from some of the narrations. But anyway, what this hadith is saying is, the Prophet ﷺ then is saying that with proper comprehension, the Prophet ﷺ is talking about those who truly understand that the attitude of a believer towards this life, which again is the lower life, is not the real life, that this life is pretty much like a prison, sijn. There are constantly complicated dynamics that restrain your ability to either achieve true ecstasy and should temper at the same time your despair, but it is your attitude towards it is that it is like a sijn, like a prison. While people who don't believe, their attitude towards this world is often that this is basically Jannah, this is the garden of delights, and so their attitude towards it is as if it is a garden of delights. And this is how so many injustices and indulgences occur. Okay, so going back to the aphorism 24, it's telling you that on this path again, our objective is maqam al-shuhud, right? So we've talked about that. Our objective is the maqam, to reach the level in which we are fully cognizant of God's presence with us all the time. And in fact, as we'll talk about, and we talked about a bit already, that we are not just fully cognizant of God's presence with us all the time, but we in fact realize that the only real presence and the only meaningful presence is God's presence, not even us. So we lose ourselves in God's love. You know, if again, you know, in the modern age has done such, it's demonic. I have to say. I mean, it's not it's a demonic thing in the modern age that so much of modernity, if you think about it, deconstructed the idea of love. So when we look at the very idea of romance and whether romantic ages, whether in music or in art or in poetry, even romantic poetry is severely looked upon by literary critics in our age. I mean, you know, poetry cannot be beautiful and cannot exalt the idea of love because who knows what love is. And anyway, we've done so much to deconstruct the idea of love, and that's why sex itself has become meaningless. It became purely a physical act, not an expression of anything, but in fact, I mean, which is completely twisted and deformed, is that people will have sex before they express love. It's a bigger deal to say I love you than to have sex with you, which is, I mean, just completely twisted and deformed. This is a much bigger topic. But part of the deconstruction of the idea of love is what conceptions of what love does, the emancipating and liberating power of love. And the emancipatory power of love in what is called in this type of literature as fana, in tearing down all the barriers and all the divisions, all the boundaries between you and your beloved, so you become one. So in that type of love, it is beyond sex, it is beyond the physical, it is beyond the material, it is beyond temporal things like I'm bored, I'm not bored, you know, I like you today, I don't like you today. It is but like all things, like if there isn't a cultural institution that supports that kind of love, human beings no longer understand it and no longer practice it because they don't comprehend it anymore. If the culture is not constantly supporting that notion in artistic expression, in, you know, in attitudes, in literature, in social practices, in what people say is expected from one another, then it loses its meaning. So why am I saying this? Because critical in the idea of loving God is this notion of fana. We, in our modern, the irony is Muslims today, if they talk about loving God at all, they love God in a secularized fashion. I love God, but there I am me, my ego is intact, and God is God, and so when the you comes into contact with the God, and God is God, and you are you, the only form that love can manifest itself is through ubudiyya, servitude. Because you're small and God is grand. And if you remain you and God remains God, then the only possible relationship is servitude. Well, how do you get from ubudiyya to rububiyya? How do you get from servitude to godliness? Well, God cannot be diluted when you understand God or try to understand God. But what you discover, you are the temporal thing. It is your ego that becomes diluted and withers away. And when you deconstruct your ego, when your ego reaches the state of fana, the state of, what's fana?
Dissolution.
Dissolution, right? Or that state of dissolution, all that remains in this relationship is the glory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But your love is intuitively realized, not intellectually analyzed, as we will talk about. And you'll see, you understand, and again, we go back and say that it is very individual and very private and very specific to one's relationship. But the secularized form of love, which maintains boundaries as if people are like nations. Here is my territory and here is the territory of the other. And then you deal with God in that fashion, the only possible way of relating to God. So I'll give you, in a famous Sufi poem, how did it go? I can't remember the exact Arabic, but the paraphrase of it, and I believe this was Junaid. Junaid says, speaking to God, that when I've come to know you, now that I've come to know you, or that I'm now knowing you, it's you could translate it in a fear you. How can I fear you? This cannot be a condition of our love. If you give this to any person who has not traveled this journey, they'll be scandalized, as happened with Junaid, with a lot of people who were scandalized by his poetry. How could you say that your relationship with God has removed the element of fear, that you no longer fear God? You can only understand it if you understand this type of romantic love, the love in which barriers vanish and borders and boundaries vanish. in which a far greater fulfillment of your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to love God so that there is no individual will beyond the will of God. So it is not that you refrain from violating anything that God, or doing anything that God doesn't want you to do, not because you fear God, but because you love God. And this is a greater fulfillment of your relationship with God than, but it, you know, and that is one of the things that if Muslims ever overcome the colonial legacy and reassert themselves in the world again, you know, challenging the philosophical bearings of this materialistic forms of understanding love, including aesthetic tastes that have completely deconstructed and delegitimated the very idea of love. It is, if Muslims don't do that, in the day and age that we live in, not even Buddhism, which has been thoroughly co-opted, or Hinduism, which has never been in the game anyway, for many different reasons that have to do with Hindu theology. But the only philosophical paradigm that can challenge what I often call the demonic influences of modernity is Islam, but not the Islam that you see today. Islam, if it is rehabilitated and returned to its pre-colonial moment. Anyway, okay. So finally, as to 24, you spend a lot of time talking about, when you talk about 24, the two of Allah's attributes that you internalize, and these attributes are the attributes of Jalal and Jamal. And basically the saying goes that your obligation is to know God, internalize God, both in Jamal and Jalal. I'll translate in a second. And that Jalal مقرون بالجمال والجمال مقرون بالجلال. Okay, so Jamal is the attribute of beauty. Beauty here is not just an aesthetic, but it is what we would describe as virtue. And Jalal is the power of compulsion, القادر فوق عباده, or القاهر فوق عباده, the God who has this attribute of power and compulsion over existence. Now, you are often experiencing both of these attributes in a variety of ways in every waking moment in your life. When God gives you, and assuming that God gives you and you are happy with God, you are coming closer to internalizing something of God's Jamal. Or if you are, you enjoy something and you say Subhanallah, or you get something that you want and you just you utter a deep Alhamdulillah, or you get a moment where you are longing for God. All of that is within the realm of Jamal, and we gravitate towards that when things are going our way. Now, when you don't have a choice in a lot of matters and you find that you are compelled, so the most, the most obvious example of that, if may God forbid, if you suffer a stroke and that imposes physical limitations on you, you are experiencing here God's Jalal, not Jamal. But the reality is that God's Jamal could not be as as one of the attributes or characteristics of the divine without God's Jalal, and God's Jalal cannot be without God's Jamal. In other words, it is like the relationship between, here I don't mean darkness in a negative sense, but I mean darkness in the sense of, let's say, positive energy as opposed to negative energy. That the positive needs the negative and the negative needs the positive. The dark needs the light and the light needs the dark. That in fact, both forces are constantly, and in fact and this is a much longer issue, but that there is never a manifestation of God's Jalal without God's Jamal, and there's never a manifestation, and the opposite is true. There's never a manifestation of God's Jamal without Jalal. That when you understand things at a greater philosophical level, you find that both display and manifest at the same time. It's just that the human ego doesn't perceive both, doesn't perceive the truth of the manifestation of both at the same time. So, in this path, if you are looking to maqam al-shuhud, you must be equally at peace with God's Jamal and God's Jalal whenever they manifest. And this is truly hard. This is much harder said than done. Because as I said, that we experience God's Jalal because we don't have a choice. Something happens and we just don't have a choice. Let's take even a simpler example. Let's say you are applying to med school, right? You really want to become a doctor. You apply to all the medical schools and you got rejected in all. You experience a moment of God's Jalal. No choice. Now, to see God's Jamal in this, at this moment, to not just say God's will has been done and I have to accept it, but to actually see in God's will Jamal. And when things are going your way and you're enjoying God's Jamal, you feel this feeling that things are going your way and you're happy. And to be completely mindful that Jamal is but an insight into God's Jalal. If I state it in this philosophical terms, that at the time, let's say things are going on and you get everything you want. And at that point, to be mindful that in fact where you think that you have all this choice, that in fact God obligates you and your choices are far more limited than you think. That's a real challenge. So this displays, although there are a lot of theologians say that God's Jamal never manifests with money, but let's put this issue aside, and let's just take the simple example of money, right? You could be you go into business and things are really working out for you and you become a millionaire. And you're just making a lot of profit, and you say, oh, alhamdulillah, every time I've gone into a business deal, I just made tons of profits. But to actually be fully cognizant at this moment that God's Jalal tells you that the money all the millions you've just made are actually not yours at all. And that you are just a trustee. And that you have very serious obligations vis-a-vis this money, far more than the 2.5% after a year. Because if you truly have an understanding and a relationship with God, you will understand that zakah is simply the beginning of the road, but it is highly inadequate. That your obligations far exceed that. So it's drilled within you that when you think you are actually suffering hardship, it reorients your attitude towards pain and hardship to think that in fact what you are experiencing is one of Allah's attributes, the attributes of Jalal. And that within the Jalal is the Jamal. It completely reorients your attitude towards difficulties, hardships, tragedies, pain. And the other way around, that when you experience God's Jamal, that within God's Jamal, God's Jalal is always present. And this doing dhikr on this and internalizing this and going through the exercises, it does really redefines your relationship with dunya, that you are always experiencing God, whether things are going your way or not going your way. You are always experiencing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. I forgot. Okay. There is a statement, it's interesting. I mean, just for the sake of completion. There is a statement that you always hear in this context, and I'm not even sure where the statement or exactly who was the original author of the statement, but it's repeated and it's لولا أن الدنيا مبنية على المكاره لجعلت منفعة الإهليلج في اللوزينج. And if it hadn't been for the fact that this earth is a place where, and I'm paraphrasing here, a place where Jalal and Jamal manifest, and a place where, in fact, Jamal and Jalal complete one another, and a place of hardship and tests. And Ihlilij was a plant that had very powerful medicinal purposes in old Arabia, and Ihlilij still exists, but it's you have to go to the right areas, right parts of the world to find it. It had a lot of medicinal usages, but was famously bitter and horrible tasting. And Luzinage was another plant that you found in in areas of Oman, in certain areas of Yemen, that was very sweet and very tasty, but absolutely had no nutritional value. And there was, very interesting poetry written in the first 2 centuries of Islam. Most of the poetry that I know of was, where, when you reflect on it, God creates a plant that has all these amazing medicinal, they can disinfect wounds, it's swallowed, can in fact fight bacteria, can, do all these things, but it just tastes horrible. And another plant that just is extremely yummy and tasty, and it absolutely just adds calories, makes you fatter, but, contributes no nutritional value. And it is as if the created Quran, which we talked about in our tafsir a lot, the created Quran reflects the revealed Quran, the relationship. It's like a testament to understanding the truth. Okay, what time is it?
8:30.
So let's go on to 25. Okay. So 25, ما توقف مطلب أنت طالبه بربك ولا تيسر مطلب أنت طالبه بنفسك. Your translation. No quest which you seek by your Lord is ever withheld from you, nor will any quest be easy if you rely upon yourself. Let me check this translation. It's close, but okay. So this translation says, no search, yeah, that's better. No search pursued with the help of your Lord remains at a standstill. That's closer to the meaning. And any search pursued by yourself will not be fruitful. So, first, to tighten the translation, you internalize that any quest, any journey, any objective in which God is your companion, whether you are given what you ask for or not, is never at an end. God is with you. So there is, put simply, there is always the hope, and there is always the possibility of a greater fulfillment of the quest. But on the other hand, if you exclude God from the picture and you rely just on yourself, then it is like saying the material world is what you see and what you get. There is nothing beyond the material. It is, tweaked a little bit by saying You know, if you are with God, you always believe that God does what is best for you. But if you're not, then there is no further, and it is irrational to think that there's anything further than the cold facts that manifest before you. The purpose of 25, however, goes back to, so that's the sort of the basic meaning, right? And that's fine. But there is a bigger purpose to 25, which we already encountered, is to tell you, internalize. Remember when we talked about إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ? And إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, if you recall, is I act with God, while إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, God is the purpose of my action is always to bring me closer to God. So God is constantly the objective. While إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, you are seeking help from God. Both are good. Both are admirable. They say, العمل بالله والعمل لله. العمل لله, where you work for the purpose of pleasing God and you want to be rewarded. That's إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You are working for the purpose of pleasing God and you expect to be rewarded. That's إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ الْعَمَلْ بِاللَّهِ. العمل بالله يوجب القربة والعمل لله يوجب المثوبة. العمل لله يوجب المثوبة means that I work for God and I expect to be rewarded. العمل بالله يوجب القربة is that it's not that I work to serve God because I want to be rewarded. I work to be in the company of God. I work with God to be closer to God. And so, what is this again? It's always in this context related to. They say عمل أهل التحقيق وعمل أهل التشريع. عمل أهل التشريع is the sort of the performance of the legalists, or the performance of the law-minded. The performance of the law-minded are engaged in the amal lillah. They do something, they comply with the law because they want to either avoid punishment or gain an advantage by complying with the law. God's law here is amal ahl al-tahqiq is it's not that you're complying with the law or that your intention is to comply with the law. Your intention is to internalize God's will. So in fact, you manifest God's will, and you manifest God's will not to gain any advantage or avoid any disadvantage with other human beings, but solely to be in God's company. So, in this context, in 25, they tell you ما توقف مطلب أنت طالبه بربك, that when you are reminded, or when you internalize the idea that nothing is impeded, and this is sort of the more literal translation, nothing is impeded if you pursue it with God, and nothing is truly achieved if you pursue it without God. What they're telling you is, you must be of those who pursue amal ahl al-tahqiq, that you must be, as a student who wants reach the level of maqam al-mushahada, that you achieve that level of being in God's presence, that you must become from ahl al-tahqiq, not ahl al-tashri'. Ahl al-tashri' are limited human beings. They can only, what they know of God is not really God, it's God's law. And they obey God's law out of self-interest. I don't want to be punished, I want to be rewarded. Okay, may Allah bless them. But if you are on this path, you cannot be from Ahlul Tashri'ah. It's Ahlul Tashri'ah then becomes disqualified. You must be from Ahlul Tahqiq. Ahlul Tahqiq, in which God's will is internalized as your own will. As Allah describes them, they love what Allah loves, and they hate what Allah hates. It's like their tastes became thoroughly consistent with the tastes of the will of the divine. And so now the deeper meaning then becomes that by definition, anything that you pursue on your own, meaning anything in which you pursue relying on your own ego, meaning anything you pursue without God's company, not God's aid, but God's company, in fact, is a lost cause. Even if you materially get what you want, it is, all you ended up serving is your ego. And that is, why is it a loss? Because it never results in illuminations, in futuhat, in ishraqat. It never results in true luminous understanding. But anything that you pursue, fully aware of God's partnership, you do it literally with God's company. You are constantly interacting with the indications of God's will and your comprehensions of God's will. Even if you don't get material gains, it is never a loss. I once heard, the best way, this helped me understand it a lot, when I was told that whatever is your objective, if the search is billah, with God, then the search is indeed the objective. It is the journey that was the objective. But whatever journey you take, without billah, without God being your companion, then you get into these meaningless material calibrations of loss and gain. You know, and you never know if a loss is really a loss and a gain is really a gain. So, you know, you got the house you want, but do you really know if, you don't know the alternatives. You don't know the other potentialities of fate. You know, if you didn't get the house, would you have been better off? Or that you got the house, you're better off? You don't know. But it doesn't matter if whatever you do with God's companionship. Because whatever material objective is, the house or what, a job or education or whatever it is, or a marriage, is really immaterial. It's God's companionship that is the point. It completely reorients everything, and especially if you keep repeating these principles. I mean, because this is a question that you get a lot. You know, okay, well, but how? You know, I understand what you're saying intellectually, but I don't feel it in my heart. You take what I say, you take the principle, and you do dhikr and ibadah. You spend as long as it takes asking Allah to put the meaning in your heart. That's the only way. There are no shortcuts. You know, people will say, well, I just want to comprehend it intellectually. It's not going to work. Because how can you intellectually understand when I tell you, you know what, if you go on this journey and you take such and such person as your companion, it will be the most fulfilling journey of your life. You will be transformed. And you say, I want to understand this intellectually. Unless you do it, unless you've experienced it, there's no way you're going to understand how can I go on, if I take this person as my companion on the journey, is going to transform me. How? What is so special about this person? And you're going to sit with me and you're going to interrogate me about this person. Well, you know, does this person have the same taste? Does this person have the same likes? Is this person philosophically deep? You know, you're going to have a million questions. And after the million questions, you're still not going to understand what I'm talking about because you haven't experienced it. And if I tell you, if you take this person as your companion, it is going to be the worst thing in your life. You can't imagine how obnoxious and horrible this person is. Again, you can intellectually interrogate me about it, but you're not going to have a real, deep, true understanding of it unless you experience it. So the intellect can bring the ideas closer, but the intellect cannot have these ideas penetrate your essence and your being and your heart. And only an act of Allah can do that. And that can only be achieved by the investment of time in dhikr and dua, where you start getting glimpses of what God's company is about, what it means to be in God's company. And bit by bit, it becomes second nature to you, where you can't imagine doing anything without God's company. Okay. What time is it?
8:45.
8:45, okay. Let's move on to 26. Yeah. So, من علامات النصح في النهايات الرجوع إلى الله في البدايات. This is actually fairly straightforward. And it complements and bolsters 25. So 26 is telling what completes your understanding of, it's saying what completes your understanding of 25. What 26 is saying is that, listen, your standard, O seeker of Allah, person who is embarking on this path because you want Allah, you want God, you want a relationship with God. Your standard for success and failure has to alter. If your standard for success and failure is material attainment or whether you get your way, and this is really, really important, because we human beings, we often measure success and failure on the basis of whether we get our way, we get what we want. And we do so behind a veil of ignorance, because we really have very limited information. And if we only knew the rest of our lives, it might be that we would have never wanted to marry who we wanted to marry. But because of the veil of ignorance, we will want to marry someone. Oh God, please make it work. Or the opposite, we don't want to marry someone. God, please, I can't stand it. Or a job, or a business, or whatever it is. But it is always behind a veil of ignorance. We think we know, but we don't know. And yet, because we are so egotistical, and because although rationally, philosophically, someone can sit here and can explain the veil of ignorance, and we can philosophically agree. And we can even do mathematically. I knew someone who actually wrote equations as to he wrote out these equations as to the percentage of probabilities in decisions, in various forms of decisions, as to all that can go wrong. And it is something like ridiculous, like we make these lifelong decisions on 2% knowledge. Something really absurd, that we make decisions about our careers, our marriages, our relationships, with such a limited amount of data, because when you work out the possibilities of all the things that could happen, they truly are astounding. But yet, although philosophically we can know that, and you can explain this and give a learned lecture about it, and we all chuckle at how stupid we are as human beings, we are so egotistical that it doesn't matter. The next time a decision comes, we always think we know. And that's because most of the time that's all we know. And it's, of course, irrational for those who believe in God, because if you truly believe that God knows and you don't know, and God knows all the possibilities and probabilities, you would just say, God, do what you know is best. But how many of us truly leave it to God in that way? So, but here, what 26 is saying is that alter the way you look at things. The measure of success and failure is not whether you get what you want. The measure of success or failure is whether whatever you do brings you closer to Allah or not. So we'll say من علامات النجح في النهايات. So if you look at the results of things, and you measure whether the result was a success or a failure. الرجوع إلى الله في البدايات, whether it brings you closer to God, brings you back to God or not. So in said that principle is, of course, anchoring the idea that if you want maqam al-shuhud, God doesn't grant that maqam except to those who fully trust God. That if you trust God's will over your own will, you're happier with God's will than you are with your own will. You're happier with what God gives you than what you would want to give yourself. Okay. 27 is a furtherance of this. Was if you elaborations. Okay. So first, man ashraqat bidayatuhu ashraqat nihayatuhu. Very straightforward. And what it's basically saying, I don't want to see how to translate ashraqat in this context. 27. No, wrong book. He whose beginning is illumined, his end will also be illumined. This translation says, same thing. He who is illumined at the beginning is illumined at the end. Okay, so it reaffirms the same concept as 26, that you here illumined at ishraq. Al-ishraq has the meaning of you want to measure things. It's like saying you want to measure things. Measure things by the end results, by what is achieved at the end. And however, what the focus is on ishraq, on the illumination, not on anything else. So why is 27 important, and why is it different than 26? Why do they state it and teach it as different? It is actually has a very specific purpose, and I can only introduce the specific purpose in sort of in bite-sized bits. So the Prophet ﷺ says in a hadith that, again, according to many scholars, is reached the point of tawatur, where the Prophet ﷺ commented about someone who said, لو خشع القلب لخشعت الجوارح. So he's asked about someone who is, claims to be close to Allah, but who at the same time struggles with behavior that is not consistent with Allah's will. In behavior that, let's say, different reports, whether it was haram or makruh, and the Prophet ﷺ simply comments to his followers, look, relationship, it's like we say, the proof is in the pudding, right? A relationship with Allah leads to predictable results. What are these results? The results are displayed in the manifestations of this relationship. So Abu Hafs was Junayd's teacher. These are two really famous Sufis. Has a statement that you sort of is drilled into you. أدب الظاهر عنوان حسن أدب الباطن. حسن أدب الباطن. That the moral character of the outside is a reflection of the moral character of the inside. Or in what was reported both as a hadith and as a maqula from a successor, السرة تدل على السريرة على السريرة, that what is inside a human being is betrayed by their outside. So why do they emphasize this so much? Well, for several purposes. One is, in this path, so many people who might, if you are working hard on this path and you are getting to level 27 or the aphorism number 27, anchored in you is, it's actually often stated in ما لم يخرج عن نفسه وهواه علمنا أنه كاذب في دعواه, that if you encounter ultimately in this path what separates the real from the pretenders is who ultimately remains egotistical or not. Even put more bluntly, as it was put to me, those who are truly on this path, their luminosity shows on their face. It shows on their character. It shows in what they care about. A person who claims to be on this path, but ultimately is an utterly self-involved person, and ultimately is a completely selfish person, or ultimately is really a completely narcissistic person. All they talk about or all they care about is themselves. A person on this path who lacks haya, who lacks shame, or a person who claims to be on this path, or you'll meet someone who told, oh, this is a Sufi, he's a student of such and such. But then when you interact with this person, you find someone who is really about themselves. What you're taught with 27 is that علمنا أنه كاذب في دعواه, that they are pretenders, they're fake, they're liars. Even to bring it even closer, what the most dangerous thing about this path is that as you are walking in this path, what shaitan comes and tricks you with is what they refer to as talabul khususiyya. What shaitan comes and tricks you with is that, look, you are fasting, you're memorizing Quran, you're reciting Quran, you're doing dhikr. Compare yourself to all these other human beings. They don't even come close to what you're doing. You must be very special. And before long, you are not really driven by Allah's companionship. What drives you is the desire to be special. What really motivates you is that you want to be exceptional, different than other human beings. And they say فَمَنْ طَلَبَ الْخُصُوصِيَّةِ كَانَ عَبْدُ الْخُصُوصِيَّةِ. That person who wants to be special, in fact, is not God's servant or God's loyal subject. They are the subject of their quest for specialty, for specialness. So they even say وَفَاتَهُ حَظُّهُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حَتَّى يَتُوبْ, that in fact they will not attain. Allah turns away from this person until they repent. There is a story that's not historical, but you're taught the story anyway. Again, like a lot of these stories, that it's attributed to the Israelites. No, actually I'm wrong. It's not the Israelites, not this one. Because it was reported from a Sufi Sheikh, Sheikh Abu Hassan. Yeah, that's right. So, okay, so the story goes, this Sheikh says that I had friends, Allahu Alam, since I was thinking of the wrong story, strike what I said about it not being historical. Allahu Alam, I don't know if it's historical or not. But the report goes that there are a group of students who went to a cave, and they say, okay, they're basically sojourners on this path. And what they're waiting for is al-Fath. Al-Fath is the first experience of Qurb al-Mushahada, of Maqam al-Mushahada, is that when a veil is lifted and you have an experience that alters the way you see reality and the way you relate to everything. And so they are worshipping intensely, and they tell each other, okay, it will come this week. It doesn't come this week. And then they say, well, it will come this month. It doesn't come this month. And they are constantly telling themselves, this week, this month, this week, this month, but it's not coming. The Fath doesn't come. And then they are surprised by a man who they haven't seen before, who visits their cave and tells them this man tells them, what are you doing? And they're saying, we're on sojourners. And then this man surprises them by telling them that who waits for al-Fath, who worships for al-Fath, they have become servants of al-Fath. But who seeks Allah doesn't wait. You pray for Allah's company, not even for the purpose of give me al-Fath. That's qillat adab, that's impoliteness with Allah. You don't demand, if you truly understand what Allah's company is, then God's company is a blessing in and of itself. And if al-Fath comes to you, that's Jamal. If al-Fath doesn't come to you, that's Jalal. And both of them are perfectly fine with you. But the reason you are reminded of the story that once well, as the story goes, that then when this person tells them this, they in the story it's supposed to be an angel who appears to them to correct their path. That they start blaming themselves for their constant talk about when is it going to come, when is it going to come, and they correct their path. But the reason that you're taught the story is about al-khususiyya, that warning that a lot of people, and they see this for instance with a lot of people who want to dream of the Prophet ﷺ, and they want to dream of the Prophet because they want to have that feeling of being these special people who had this wonderful experience of being visited by the Prophet in a dream. If Allah gives you the blessing, alhamdulillah. But if Allah doesn't, alhamdulillah. As long as your journey is in Allah's company. Because watch out from the fallacy of wanting to feel special. Okay. So, two things. The warning about al-khususiyya, as we said, and the second is the warning about so many people who will claim that they've walked this path, but God's light doesn't shine from their face, or you don't see evidence of God's either Jamal or Jalal from them, and that's an impossibility. Such a person would be beautiful, and their beauty would emanate naturally. Okay. What time is it now?
9:10.
Okay. So we probably have time to do one more. Number. I just remember that they often say الوصول في قربته والحصول في حضرته. الوصول في قربته والحصول في حضرته. That what this saying is that you want to know what success is. You want measure success by his qurba and his hadra. Measure success by whether the journey or wherever you end up brings you or leaves you closer to Allah, and how you are in terms of Allah's presence. Do you feel Allah's presence, the truth of Allah's presence, to a greater extent or not? Because that is the real measure for a seeker on this path of whether something is successful or not. Okay. 28, which again bolsters and supports 27. ما استودع في غيب السرائر ظهر في شهادة الظواهر. So, 28. Maybe I didn't mark it in this book. It's quite possible. Okay, forget it. Let's do this one. 28, this book translates it as, whatever is harbored in the hidden innermost will inevitably appear in the outer world. So, ما استودع في غيب السرائر, whatever is hidden in the innermost, in what is held, what is inside of human beings, ظهر في شهادة الظواهر, is inevitably will be what appears on the external surface. So, I mean, you already see in the ways that it bolsters 27. But, but then, of course, then why do we need 28 as a separate person? What is emphasized here, and it blends actually. Okay, that يجب أن تظهر السريرة في العمل الصالح الطيب. That, okay, you are now in this path, and by the time you reach aphorisms 28, by this time you have spent a lot of time in khalwa, a lot of time in the hadra, you have spent a lot of time in your dhikr and in fasting and in acts of worship, and practice and real life it bolsters this testimony, because it actually what happens in real life, in real practice. You start being the temptation, you start truly becoming you start isolating. I mean, you spend so much time, just you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you lose sight of the very critical point that in Islam it is meaningless to say that my inside is beautifying if beauty is not exhibited upon you externally. So أن تظهر السريرة في العمل الصالح الطيب, that if your inside is truly beautifying, it must manifest itself in kind, merciful, beautiful acts. So as you've noticed, it is constantly, and if you have a good teacher, the teacher is constantly balancing out the student. You tell the student, what good deeds have you performed? Well, I'm spending all this time in worship and so. Well, you must break your isolation and go perform good deeds. People, if you truly understand what controlling the ego is and what closeness to Allah is must translate in abundant acts of goodness. A stark reminder that you cannot be good in theory, or you cannot be good by removing challenges and tests. It's very easy for you to say, I'm a beautiful human being, but you're never tested. You're a beautiful human being because there's never anyone around but you and yourself, and that's it. Beauty, by its terms, is relational. Beauty is in the dynamic between Jalal and Jamal. So in other words, it must be tested and it must manifest when challenged, when there is a reason for beauty to rise to the circumstance. And so you are taken away from your entirely self-referential context and say, serve, perform. So that's your al-zahir min atul batin. That again, the thing that if and I mean quite often in people, young people who are doing this and in this path and they when they reach around this time. I don't know if this, I actually read evidence that this is even not just a modern thing, but it's even in medieval. That inevitably at this point, tension arises between them and their family. Because they're spending so much time in isolation and worship, and their family, typically mother, father, uncles, aunts, the like, start getting concerned and worried and exerting family pressure. And if you have, again, or if you have a good teacher, your family must be dealt with beautifully, although you are traveling this path. If your family experiences this process through acts of ugliness, then again, that's disqualifying. A good sheikh will actually throw you out for yelling at your mother or disrespecting your mother. Modern Muslims often confuse obedience with respect. You might not obey your mother or your father, especially if they tell you not to pursue this path anymore, but that doesn't mean that you disrespect them. You might not obey them, but you continue respecting them. More bluntly, you're told على المريد أن لا ينخدع بما يتوهم من صلاح السريرة دون العلانية, which says very explicitly, al-murid is a student, the sojourner, the student of this path. That a student on this path must not be ever fooled by what some people imagine and claim, that it is possible for someone's external character to be different than what they are in the inside. And what they mean explicitly by this is, which is was quite common in pre-modern times and quite common in modern times, that you find people who are on this path, or people who've achieved some degree of success on this path, frankly arrogant and haughty and aloof, and they somehow will, it's like they start treating other human beings as if they're all backwards, and we know something you don't know, and you're all idiots, you don't know what's good for you, but we're different. And what this anchors in a student, and if they have a good teacher, is that it doesn't work this way. The inside and the outside must be in sync, in beauty or in ugliness. Similarly, again, I'm just writing things that من ادعى بقلبه معرفة الله ومحبته يجب أن يظهر ذلك في أثاره وثماره. Things that I remember either from lectures or from reading or whatever, that whoever claims that they know God and they love God, this must manifest في أثاره, in whatever they do, وثماره, in their fruit, in the fruit of their character and the fruit of their deeds. If it doesn't, So the impossibility of a sojourner on this path, of a traveler on this path, who exhibits ugly character or ugly characteristics, arrogance, rudeness, and so on. Okay, this is, I believe, have I forgotten anything? Oh. The one thing I forgot is something that will actually elaborate upon with 29 and 30. So, but it's introduced at this point, or to be, so to set, to create the setting for the further elaboration, is that limit the principle that as-sara'ir wal-zawahir, what is inside and what is external, must be consistent. Especially in a person's conception, a student's conception and understanding of luminosity, that in order to, if maqam al-shuhud, that state in which you are cognizant of Allah's presence, Allah's the manifestation of divinity and the presence of a divine is a state of luminosity. That is a state of enlightenment and light. You cannot be ready to receive luminosity if your inside is not luminous and if your outside is not luminous. So the emphasis in that you are cleansing, as we will see further, that you are confronting the ego and confronting your weakness to cleanse your inside so that it will be truly luminous. Because without that luminosity of the inside, you will not tahza bi maqam al-shuhud, as they say it. You will not attain the maqam of experiencing God's unadulterated luminosity. But the question that you often get is, well, how do I know if my insides have been cleansed? And the answer is, look at yourself externally. Because the external of zahir will tell you what dwells in the sara'ir. What your external will tell you what dwells inside. So concretely, if a student, for instance, comes and says, I don't know if I've reached the goal. and say, well, examine your external self, and you find that your external self still gets irritated quite often. People annoy you. An indication that your inside is not there yet. Or your external self is easily threatened, you're easily offended. Again, you're told, go back, you need a lot of more work to do. A person whose inside is truly luminous doesn't get annoyed. Or you easily get jealous. You are always interested in comparing yourself to whatever the field. You know, you always want to know what others have done to see how you compare. An indication that you're still far away. Or you look at yourself externally and you notice you're always worried and you're always anxious. You don't trust what tomorrow will bring. An indication that your sarira, your inside, still needs a lot of work. So students are often surprised, by the way, that when they think, or they're hoping, that their sheikh will look into their eyes or look into their face and tell them, here's my son, my daughter, you've reached the goal. You know, now you're ready to receive Allah. It doesn't work that way. Or not if you have a real teacher, a good teacher. A real teacher or a good teacher will question you or invite you to question your externality. How are you? Do you talk about people? Do you gossip about people? Do you get annoyed? Do you get impatient? Do you get anxious? These are the things that are like barometers as to whether your inside has been cleansed sufficiently or not. And that is, now that I've said it, I can't believe that I was going to forget this. I mean, because it's actually perhaps the most important lesson about Principle 28. That is the main thing was 28, and the main reason that we get to 28 and was separated from 27. Okay, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. So we've covered what? 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 5. MashaAllah, very good. This is a record. Yeah, see, that's a feeling of Jamal that must be tempered with a memory of Jalal. Because inshallah, next halaqah, who knows, we might just cover one. So, okay, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much. There are never enough words to thank you. It's like when we go through these sessions, again, 2 hours flies by. It feels like the time just passed so quickly. And you gave us so much depth. I'm always struck, maybe I again sound like a broken record, but when I read like the very simple translations in these books that you reference, and I imagine, like, I know people have reading groups where they read this book together and then they discuss it. I cannot imagine, how much more depth we get when you take us through this journey. And because it's not just about us thinking about, like if I read something like, what looks like when you start with Illumination and you end with Illumination, it's like you give us so much more than that. And I just can't imagine how we would access this knowledge without, you guiding us through it. So thank you so much. It's truly incredible. And I wanted to actually mention, since you were talking at the end about the vessel, is in the Prophet's pulpit in volume 1, which is the blue book, in the first part where it's called Foundations from Darkness to Light. Chapter 2 is called On Evaluating Moral Character, Trusting Intuition, and Cleaning Your Vessel. And I remember that this was a really important khutbah that you gave a long time ago, a few years ago, and the idea was just so powerful about, how, like, what is your vessel? Is it clean? Is it not clean? Are you ready to receive light? So if you want to read more about that discussion, it's in that chapter. It was just so powerful. And again, like all of these things that you share with us are so immediate in application and so transformative. I know I continue to get a lot of messages from people about how this whole Book of Illuminations engagement is very grounding and very enlightening and changes people immediately. So it's so valuable. Thank you so much. Alhamdulillah. So thank you everyone for being with us. I'm excited to continue on this journey. Good job. We did 5. Alhamdulillah, Jamal and Jalal. And inshallah, next week we will see what Allah allows us to cover. Inshallah. So everyone have a wonderful week. It's great to see everyone here. And don't forget, if you guys come across a really good excerpt, just need a little help from my friends, so send me a quick email just to let me know so we can cut some excerpts for people to share and benefit.
Sure.
So inshallah, have a wonderful week
Assalamu alaikum.
and lots of love. Assalamu alaikum.